This is Community Unity Now, the D-Tycoon Show. I am Trudy Leong, Administrator of the Rogers Park Chamber of Commerce. The President of the Rogers Park Chamber of Commerce, my co-host, Bill Morton, cannot be with us today. He suffered an accident, had a serious fall, so he is recuperating. He is getting better now, but of course, there's still a long way to go, and we appreciate any prayers that you would, and good vibes that you would send Bill's way. Our very special guest today is John Bartlett. He is the Executive Director of the Metropolitan Tenants Organization, MTO. Welcome, John.
Well, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Well, John, speaking of falls and accidents, what issues do tenants bring to you about accidents that happen and how it affects them?
Well, tenants bring a lot of different kinds of accidents. Like, I think that actually the most common accident that we have is when the ceiling falls on tenants, which is quite upsetting for anybody if that, just all of a sudden they have the ceiling, and it's oftentimes that they've warned the landlord and said, the ceiling's leaking, something's happening, you need to take care of it, and then all of a sudden it comes crashing down on them, and that's really quite disturbing. And, it is the landlord's fault. They are supposed to maintain the unit, and any time there's a leak, because water can damage things and cause lots of problems. So that's, I would say, the most common call of accidents that we get, though we do have lots of other kinds of accidents that are happen.
So the sagging ceilings, that would be caused by either a leaking roof or leaking water from the unit above?
Yes, one of those two. Oftentimes, I would say more often a leaky roof. Sometimes it may not. It may be the roof's leaking and the water travels down the wall even and then pools over somewhere. And, I think it's just something that, is a cost that is always there. You always got to make sure your roof, if the outside's not sealed, then that's a problem. And I think this is especially becoming important as, with global warming and all that we're getting these larger and more intense rainfalls, and you really need to make sure the exterior of your building is well sealed.
And what about if the unit above, let's say they have a sink that they stopped up and forgot about, or a bathtub, how does a landlord, what are the responsibilities of the parties involved with that?
Well, it's first off, the tenant who's experiencing the problem, it's the landlord that has to take care of it, because even if it's the upstairs tenant, it's still the landlord's building, and they still have to make sure that the tenant below is okay. Certainly, the tenant could be held liable by the landlord upstairs if they let their bathtub overflow because they weren't paying attention, that they were negligent in some ways. But if it is the landlord's responsibility still to fix it. And sometimes, like, there's internal leaks in the pipes that nobody really knows about, and those get to be, once again, where once the tenant reports it, the landlord needs to get out and inspect it and find out what the issue is.
Does the tenant need to have a paper trail or electronic trail about having notified the landlord? I
always encourage tenants to make paper trail for everything. Actually, it's I think a friend of mine once told me is a contract or something is worth the piece of paper that it's put on. So anything verbal is like the landlord or anybody can always, you didn't say that. So it's always good, even if you talk to the landlord and they said they're going to get out, to always then follow up with an email or a text, say, per our conversation, you said you were going to come out and check out the leak. Or that I just wanted to follow up, there's a leak in our apartment. We talked yesterday, there's a leak in our apartment, please take care of it. Whatever you do, always follow up a verbal conversation with some sort of a note as a reminder. And I think the other thing is always just to be aware of is that sometimes you call the landlord and who knows, they may be driving and they'll forget. Mm-hmm. So, and we don't want to, we want to lessen that possibility of them forgetting. So that's why you always follow up with something in writing.
We recently had a friend that spoke with us about her landlord who was not maintaining the building, but the rent is reasonable. And then there are a lot of things wrong with that building. It's not a large building. It's more like maybe just a house and divided into a couple of sections or like that. So and she does not have a lease. And is she at the mercy of her landlord without a lease? And she does not have a right to a lease if the landlord does not give her a lease, right? Or does she have a right to a lease if she has been a tenant for a long time?
Well, there's a lot of different questions there. First, about the lease. Certainly the tenant has a contract with the landlord. The landlord, if they want to get rid of them or raise the rent, they have to give them a notice. If they've been there for more than 3 years, they'd have to give them a 120-day notice so that they have some time to be looking in that. So that there is a contract, and it's even if it's not in writing or if the lease is ended and nothing's been re-signed, there still is a contract with the landlord. So in that way, that the landlord still has to follow certain rules and all that. Then about the repairs, certainly that's one of the things that that we get all the time is about tenants who are more marginal or don't have all the money, that they're always tend to be living in conditions that are not up to code. But the city law still maintains that the landlord has to maintain the building and they have to maintain it to certain standards of the building code, so that they do have to fix it. And the landlord's not allowed to retaliate against the tenant for asking for repairs. So if there's something like, well, I have a leaky faucet, we'll just use a little thing, the landlord can't just say, well, too bad, and I don't have to fix it. No, the landlord needs to fix it because the law says that you need to have a working faucet, and a leaking one isn't working. Or if there's more serious problems, the landlords do need to take care of it. And it doesn't matter whether you're paying not very much rent or you're paying $5,000 a month in rent. The landlord still needs to maintain the building up to the standards of what the building code is.
And this tenant, she's concerned because the landlord is very elderly, and she kind of manipulates that. The police were called to her, but she was able to hide from the police the conditions of her own unit, the landlord's unit, and the tenant does want to remain at that unit because it's very hard for her to find something that has the same kind of rent. So is there any recourse for her, anything that she could do? She's actually tolerating some conditions with like infestations and all that. Is there any advice that you would give her?
Well, does she live in the unit with the landlord?
No, I think they're like next door, and then the units are connected, and that's enough for the problems to migrate. And then of course her own unit needs repairs as well, which the landlord does not always do.
Well, your friend's in a little bit of more of a tricky situation because the landlord lives on the premises, and if it's less than 6 units and the landlord lives on the premises, then many of the Chicago landlord and tenant ordinance rules don't apply, that they cut out an exception for owner-occupied buildings of that nature. So normally I would say, oh, well, if it's pests, the tenant could probably contact a pest control place and give the landlord a written notice saying that I'm going to hire a pest control person to come out and do this and reduce my rent if you don't take care of it. But because of the landlord lives on site, they're unable to do that. Certainly the tenant could complain to the city, and the city could come out and do an inspection, but then that could trigger a lot of other issues, or that the city will come out and do a full inspection, which would be a good thing, but then that they're also going to find other problems and they're going to make the landlord fix them. So I would just say it's a bit more of a tricky situation as to what to do, just because of the situation the tenant is in. I usually start up, I would talk with the landlord about it and say, can't we get a pest control person? I can take care of it. I can make the phone call. I can do these things. Is trying to negotiate it just so that way if the landlord elderly, they may not just even know how to go about looking up all this stuff and doing it, and they may be grateful for the help. So I think I would start by talking to the landlord and making a suggestion that, why don't we get a pest control person to come out and look at this and figure out, maybe how to spray or to do other things, or what can be done to eliminate the pests.
Mm-hmm. Well, her situation, she has tried to talk with the landlord, so she does not have a lease, even though she wants one. So because it's an owner-occupied building, so even those protections don't apply to her. Like if she has been living there for a certain amount of time, those protections, like a contract, do not apply to her.
There's still a contract. The landlord still, no matter what, is supposed to maintain the building up to the building standards set out by the city of Chicago. So those don't change. They're part of any time anybody rents a unit, that the landlord is bound to maintain the unit up to those codes. It's more like, what happens if the landlord doesn't do that? That's when it gets to the problem, and that then there are fewer options for the tenant to take. Like, they can't just call a pest control person out and take it off the rent. That's not necessarily legal. That's why, I would say more, you're going to probably have to work out a situation, or if you want, you can engage the city, have an inspector come out and find out, and they'll inspect the tenant's unit, and then if they find problems, they'll cite the landlord, and then the landlord's going to have to go to building court and all those kind of things. So, that's what the rules are regarding, in her case, as to what she can do.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that. What about conditions for when you talked about no retaliation, landlord cannot retaliate. So
Yes.
What about retaliation in her case? If the landlord retaliates against her,
retaliation is generally, I think there's a state law also that prohibits retaliation. So no matter, landlords aren't allowed to retaliate, if she's complained to the city, for instance. That would be something that all tenants are protected from.
And what constitutes retaliation?
Retaliation could be terminating the lease, raising the rent, reducing the services that the tenant receives, such as, like, if they get parking and the landlord says, well, you complained, I'm going to take away your parking. Those would be all ways that landlords do and have retaliated.
Mm-hmm. But is there enforcement of the anti-retaliation? If there is proof, how is the burden of proof? How difficult is it for the tenant to?
Well, it is somewhat difficult, no matter whether the tenant's protected or it is covered under the landlord-tenant law or not. In that oftentimes the way retaliation is documented or prevented is through an eviction and being in eviction court. And I would never think it's a good thing to end up in eviction court, even if you're in the total right. I always try to figure out ways to make sure that you don't end up doing that. You might want to encourage the tenant to give our hotline a call, and they might be able to help them draft a letter that could help, maybe get the landlord, because the landlord probably doesn't want to go to court either. No one wants to go to court. Mm-hmm. So that, and maybe with the little negotiations that they could avoid that. Mm-hmm. But generally, retaliation is something that the judge could then decide if there's retaliation that would stop the eviction. Uh-huh. Or if there's retaliation and the tenant doesn't pay the rent increase and the judge then decides that it's retaliation, then they can't make that rent increase.
Does the tenant have to pay for the court cost and hire a lawyer if they want to claim retaliation?
Generally, it's the landlord, because the landlord's the one initiating the
retaliation.
Claim. Yes, yeah. But so that they're the ones that have to, at least for the court costs for around eviction and that. I would probably always encourage somebody to get an attorney, in which case the tenant may have to pay for the attorney costs. Though the law does allow if the tenant wins, then they could try to collect the attorney fees from the landlord.
Does the Metropolitan Tenants Organization help tenants find these tenants' rights attorneys?
We do have a list, and people can call and ask about that. And there are some pro bono ones, but most of them are more engaged in just pure eviction after the eviction's already been filed. So, but yes, we could help them find an attorney. They can come to us. Our hotline number, just in case anybody's looking for an attorney, is 773-292-4988. So you can call there, and we could kind of refer you to an attorney either in the city of Chicago, or if there are other places in Cook County that we can also make referrals.
Okay. What other issues usually arise between tenants and landlords that are very hard to resolve?
Well, I think generally repairs are the biggest issue that we always get. So we've been talking a lot about that. Mm-hmm. Then can get hard to resolve, especially if the landlord doesn't want to fix them, because then you end up kind of butting heads, and it generally is difficult and all that, especially if you don't want to try to engage the city and call them in for an inspection. Even then, that always takes a while too. I would say another issue that we've been getting quite a bit of with all this rain recently is a lot of flooding. People's units, particularly in basement units and all that. And that gets to be a more difficult issue because the tenants lost a lot of their property. And the law doesn't necessarily really cover that issue very well. It certainly says that the tenant has the right to terminate the lease. The landlord has to return any prepaid rent, has to return security deposit. But as far as loss of property, that's not covered as well, because, rainstorms cannot necessarily be predicted. Landlords are supposed to technically tell the tenant if the building's been prone to floods, whatever prone to floods means. But if it just kind of happens once every 10 or 15 years, that's going to be really difficult to document. Or if it happens every year, like even a moderate rainfall causes problems, well, the landlord should tell the tenant, and they could potentially be held negligent for not informing the tenant if there's a flooding, if it regularly floods.
Well, what if the landlord actually tells the tenant, this unit might flood, but I'll give you this unit for a lower rent, and the tenant agrees to it. So is the tenant's loss every time it floods, and the tenant loses property?
I don't want to guarantee that, maybe because in some ways maybe the landlord really shouldn't be renting the unit in some ways. So there could be some liability on the landlord's part, though it's getting a little outside of what the law is, at least the landlord-tenant law. So I would say they could possibly be held liable. And the other thing that if I was a tenant in that situation, they might want to consider getting renter's insurance. I don't know if they ask all the time, but certainly renter's insurance would be one way to where the tenant could get some coverage, perhaps, is if they get that.
And does the MTO have suggestions as to what good sources of renter's insurance?
No, we don't really get into the renters, wanting to say, oh, this is a better company than this company. We pretty much stay on, here's what the laws are, and here's what you can do to enforce the laws as a renter, what your rights are and how to enforce those rights. So, but we don't get into making referrals to kind of private companies that are going to charge people.
Okay. And what about, let's say there is a problem, how heavy is the burden of proof on the renter, how to document conditions and the whole problem? So
well, I always tell tenants, once again, you start out by putting things in writing, saying, dear landlord, we have a problem and all this. And I encourage folks also to take some photos. I mean, photos can be totally useful to start saying, here's a picture of what's happening, please take care of it. And then you can start documenting each time I would send it in. And I think photos can also really alert also the landlord how serious the problem is. There's a difference between a drip leak and a deluge or whatever. And sometimes they don't know, or sometimes they say, oh, there's a leak, or sometimes, and then they can see like, oh, the ceiling's starting to crack. I better get out there. So I always encourage, take photos and document things in whatever way that you can do that. So writing, pictures, whatever way that there is to document it, and that will help the tenant also if they do have to go to court, and eventually they'll have these pictures and everything else.
what about there are many buildings now that have cameras, and what if the tenant knows that there's a camera that on a situation that's happened, and the tenant wants the footage, and is there any way that the tenant could make sure that the tenant gets that footage without the landlord maybe trying to get rid of the footage?
I'm not really clear on what those laws are. We're not really quite in there as like what access or what they're allowed to have. I would, I'm assuming a little bit of this is around police laws and all that. Like if there's criminal activity, then I think the police should be able to get that. That would be able to help the landlord, the tenant, if there was a crimes or something like that. I'm not sure what other types of issues that there could be that, but I don't think the landlord is required to provide that just free to the tenant.
Mm-hmm. And what about the neighbor issues? If neighbors are not getting along, and then various parties are going to be saying, "Oh, it's that neighbor that's at fault," and of course it's vice versa. Any suggestions about how to resolve that besides moving on?
Those are some of the hardest problems to resolve, are neighbor-to-neighbor disputes, because one is kind of legally you have very little ways to enforce your rights upon somebody else because you don't have any real relationship with them. They're just like a neighbor. So you generally have to go through the landlord. I would generally always say you have to start informing the landlord of what's going on if there is a problem with the tenant, and start in the same way documenting that as best you can. Like if there's noise, document it, audio tape it, so that you could just show how loud it is, and if it's a difficult issue, you know. And I don't know what the relationship with the other tenant is, whether you can actually go and try to have a conversation, just saying,
Right.
oh, by the way.
Well, John, we are out of time.
Okay.
Thank you for the answer. It has been very helpful, even though you weren't able to finish it. This is John Bartlett. He is the executive director of Metropolitan Tenants Organization. John, could you give the viewers, if they want to learn more about the Metropolitan Tenants Organization, how could they reach them, and where could they learn more?
Well, our hotline number, once again, is 773-292-4988, or you could go to our website, which is www.tenants-rights.org. We also have a app, which is at rents. Darn, I'm spacing out right now, so I'm going to have to go with the
app app information is available on the website.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, John Bartlett, Executive Director of MTO, Metropolitan Tenants Organization. Thank you so much for joining us on Community Unity Now, the D Tycoon Show. From Bill Morton, President of the Rogers Park Chamber of Commerce, and me, Trudy Leong, Administrator of the Rogers Park Chamber of Commerce, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you again next week.